Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is Dr. Tracy McCarthy. We're going to be doing a brief examination on Japheth, the lost tribe. What brought us here was an examination initially of Deuteronomy 28. And so there was an attempt to do an exegesis of that, and there was a place wherein we got stuck because what was noted was that where the word Egypt appears, that's not actually in scripture. That's not even a translation. It's inserted in there multiple times throughout scripture, but the word actually is related to this entity known as Mizraim or some variation thereof. And so we're going to be doing a little bit of history on trial, a little bit of theology on trial, and a little bit of psychology of identity along with some symbology. Of course, we're going to be looking at etymologies in order to get a better understanding of this whole dynamic of the conflation of Ham and Japheth, and in some instances, Japheth and Shem. There is definitely a supplanting dynamic that is going on with respect to Japheth, and this has resulted in Japheth actually being what would be considered a lost and dispersed tribe of people. So let's look at this. One of the first things to consider here is the naming dynamic and the way the names are pronounced. It's unclear why these names are mispronounced or why they are presented to us in such a way. The names of the sons of Noah are Shem, Ham, and Japheth. That's the English version of these names. The first name is pronounced Shame. The second name is pronounced Calm. And the third name is pronounced Yapet or Yapet. And so it's very interesting that we have these odd pronunciations for these three names again, because it is actually possible to pronounce the accurate pronunciation of these particular words. Now, in focusing on this name, Japheth or Yapet, what we find is that the name means essentially abundant, spacious, enlarge, expand, wide, and open, and all of the different terms that coincide with these constructs. And so this is a name that essentially focuses on expansion and growth. And so that's the essence of this particular name. Now, what has contributed to this confusion related to Japheth and Japheth's identity is that Japheth has essentially been supplanted. And also, according to the narratives, Japheth has been dispersed. Sound familiar? Okay, so Japheth actually has a diaspora, and we've talked about Japheth before, but what we saw before was that it was still sort of unclear about these various identities and how this dispersion actually came about. We have a little bit more insight now that we better understand that Japheth is conflated with Calm and in some instances conflated with Shem or Shame. And so what we're going to be looking at very quickly is how we know that Japheth was supplanted and how it is played out in scripture and how Japheth essentially disappears for the most part in terms of many of the narratives in scripture. And Japheth is replaced by another word that is then, of course, confused with Ham's identity. Now, we've touched on this before, and it's interesting to reflect on again. Japheth is an interesting name. Of course, it means enlarge, expand, abundant, but it's also, for some reason, associated with this idea of beguiling and deceiving and supplanting. What's interesting about the etymology of this particular name is that there are instances wherein the name is associated with supplanting, deceiving, beguiling, but more readily associated with being supplanted, being deceived, and being beguiled. Now, while Shem is presented as the older brother in many narratives, what you see when looking at the direct translation coming out of the Hebrew is that Japheth is presented as the elder. You also see this in the context of the KJV and then the NIV reiterating that. And here you can see at Genesis 10:21 that Japheth is understood as the brother who is the elder. And so you see this with reference to Shem. So there's a correlation here going on with Shem and Japheth, pointing out here that Shem is the brother of Japheth, the elder. And here you also see this in the Darby translation, and it indicates the brother of Japheth, the elder. And of course, with the NIV, you have more plain language here, and it indicates whose older brother was Japheth, and it's referring to Shem in this particular instance. Translations and transliterations are how we came to the conclusion that there was this conflation going on, and we're going to look at some of the languages that pointed the way to this particular conflation with respect to the transliterations for those specific languages. And so the languages that sort of gave away the identity of Japheth and correlated Japheth with the images that you see on the screen are Belarusian, Bosnian, Bulgarian, Croatian, Russian, Serbian, Ukrainian, and specifically Scots Gaelic and the Welsh. Now, this is important because the entities understood as Scots also identify with the depictions that you see. And there's also a narrative in terms of Irish history that places them squarely under that Japheth umbrella. And there's also the Y haplogroup dynamic that we've talked about before, and we'll touch on that again. And so what has been noted is that Japheth, that is not actually pronounced Japheth, um, this entity is synonymous with the word Egypt. This is not obvious on the surface, but once you start to really analyze what you see, it becomes very clear. Now, this is very confusing because, of course, Egypt has been correlated with Mizraim, and Mizraim has been correlated with Ham or Kam. However, for whatever reasons we are not completely clear about at this point, Japheth has been obscured. And also with the way that the word has been pronounced, there has been confusion. And so therefore it was difficult to make this correlation to see that Egypt is a transliteration of Japheth. What's also noteworthy is Japheth, in terms of the narrative in scripture, is associated with the islands of the earth, water, and mounds. So you can see how this all fits together, given the history of people who are associated with certain places around the earth and also specifically associated with islands and mounds. Another word that is associated with Japheth, or is a transliteration of Japheth, is Ptah or Ptah. This is also a transliteration of Egypt. Again, it's very difficult to see it automatically because there is not clarity about the letter exchanges, and there are many letter exchanges going on here, but there is a specific conservation of consonants that you will come to see, and that conservation of consonants is what gave away the correlation between Egypt and Japheth. And because there was a dispersal dynamic, an enslavement dynamic with respect to the Egyptians or Japheth, there was also a dispersal. And so, therefore, the identities again being obscured. It's really interesting how these letter exchanges go, but what you have is a conservation of the Y, the P, and the T. And this is significant because that is the essence of both Japheth and Egypt. It's also important to keep in mind that that G and J, it has a replacement. And also there are alternate sounds or pronunciations for the P and the G. We've talked about this before with betacism, but there are so many letters that have these interchanges. And also, when you have a language that is not focused on vowels but preserving the consonants, it's important to remove the vowels so that you can see the consonants that are remaining or that are being preserved throughout various languages. Now, we will go into more detail so that you can see how this all came about, this revelation came about. But for the most part, what you can see on the screen is that Japheth also is, in terms of etymology, Patha or Patah. What's interesting, however, is it's presented in Hebrew as Patha, but that sound and that letter combination is not actually there. And so what you have essentially is Patah. And so you have Yapit, which is Ptah, and also Ptah. So all of this essentially is the same thing when you start to break it down and you understand what letters are actually making which sounds. Because sometimes you see something or you're presented with something and you are told that something is pronounced a particular way, and you find out that it's incorrect. And that's what we have with Japheth. I don't even know how you get from Japheth to Yapit to Ptah, but um, it's very clear that that's what's going on here. Why there is this confusion created with this name is unclear, but this is what we have. So what's important about this is the identity of Japheth. Japheth is associated with a particular Egyptian deity, interestingly, and that Egyptian deity is Ptah or Ptah. Now, what makes this noteworthy is that the entity that was exchanged in terms of birthright and birth order is associated with the deity known as Set. And we're going to look at that again. And so, what has been noted with respect to etymology, with respect to meaning, with respect to character in terms of name, is that Shem and Seth are synonymous with Set. So, all three are the same. And so there really is no distinction in terms of when you start to look at the root and you look at the meanings, you have essentially the same thing. And so with Japheth, interestingly, Japheth is synonymous with Ptah, and Shem is synonymous with Set, also with Seth. And we've talked about that before. We're going to look at some other entities that are also associated with Set that are also associated with Japheth. Very interesting here. And so the other entity that is associated with Japheth, as far as we know, that is emblematic of Set or Seth is Akhenaten. And Akhenaten is not only emblematic of Set, but has a number of characteristics related to Set. And so Set is understood as the hidden one. And what you find is that Set is hidden inside of a number of entities, a number of philosophies, a number of theologies, and a number of histories. And so Set is simply going by a number of names. And so Set is constantly in disguise. And so also what's noteworthy is that Set or Seth, there's also a letter replacement there, and so it could be Seth or Seph. So Seth or Seph. And most notably, we have Set inside of Scotia. So Set is hiding inside of this entity understood as Queen Scotia, who is understood as the mother of all Scots. Okay. And so when you look at the deconstruction of Scots, what you come away with is Set. And so Scot is actually another transliteration of Set or Seth. And here you can just visually get an idea of this conservation of these letters, this YP and this T. And when you look at the etymology of Japheth, interestingly, you see that YPT can serve as the root of the actual name. And so it's also the root of the actual name of Egypt. And so they are one and the same. Japheth is Egypt. However, it's not clear how Egypt got associated with Ham. Okay, there is an entity under Mizraim that has some of the letters that are shared, but the meaning doesn't mean the same. And with Japheth, you have a dynamic wherein Japheth is correlated with the dynamics of Ptah and correlated with the dynamics of Egypt. Again, it's unclear how this whole conflation came about or how this identity appropriation came about. But what we have right now so far is that Japheth is Egypt, is Ptah. And in contrast to Shem, who is Seth, Set, Akhenaten also, and Scotia. What's also interesting is that Japheth, again, is that lineage through which many people who identify as Irish are coming, and the Irish have quite a history. They have quite a chronicle of their ancestry. It's very, very interesting. And so, and that ancestry narrative leads right to Japheth. What's interesting also about that is that Japheth is an identity that is obscured and also demonized. And so it's very interesting that they would be willing to take on that identity if it was not really their identity. And finally, we come to the R1BY haplogroup. And finally, all of this actually hangs together. It all starts to make sense when you look at who Japheth happens to be and the relationship between Egypt and the R1B and the lack of relationship between the entities that are in what's known as Egypt today and the entities that claim this ancestry that are in other parts of the world. And so those entities that claim this Japheth identity, that claim this Ptah identity, that claim this Egyptian ancestry through Scotia, they also have this R1BY haplogroup. And so, what's also interesting about that is with respect to that R, again, that R is a signifier of the head, the chief, the first one. And so that would be consistent with the actual identity of Japheth. It also perhaps helps explain some of these entities that are dispersed below Europe, below North Africa, mhm, that also have this R1B dynamic going on, and then the high prevalence of the R1B in the United States and in other specific parts of the Americas. And again, remember that Japheth is associated in scripture with the Isles. They are considered the people of the Isles. They are considered the Gentiles, the nations of the Isles. And when you look at the British Isles, the Isles, the Scots Isles, you look at the Americas and the Isles, you look at the Isles around the world, you see where this dispersion is taking place. I believe when we looked at this before, there was a notation of the name Japheth appearing in Vanuatu. Okay, so this island dispersion is very noteworthy. And also, this correlation between Japheth or these entities associated with Japheth and these presentations of these mounds all over the place. And so finally, this leads us to some questions about a number of things. One of which, going back to how some of this started with that Deuteronomy 28, is exactly what's going on in Deuteronomy 28. Um, the passage itself is unclear. It's very difficult to read. It's very difficult to deconstruct, but you have it presented. It's in the community section. Um, but you have a dynamic and a narrative wherein people are saying that people would be taken back to Egypt in ships. However, the place that's identified or the name that's identified in scripture is not actually Egypt. The name and the place identified is Mizraim. What's noteworthy about that is, according to Strong's Concordance, Mizraim historically was situated not in Northeast Africa, but Northwest Africa, which would be the area of Mauretania and Morocco. Hopefully, others have some research that they can add to this information, some additional insights. Perhaps they will be expounding on this particular topic and this dynamic. And if you do, feel free to share that in the comments section. And also, if you just have some general insights, questions, or comments about what we are looking at here or anything that's related to it, please share that. Insight is helpful when it's coming from a variety of directions. And so, the more that we have in terms of insight, the better. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care. See you soon.